The first thing I saw was the dented silver key on my aunt's old key ring. And then my cousin said very softly that I should be realistic about what kind of woman actually needed a whole duplex. I stared at the chipped yellow countertop between us and said nothing because the way he smiled when he said it made my skin go cold. My name is Colette. I am 34, and I work nights as a respiratory therapist at a hospital outside Pittsburgh. Most of my life has been measured in alarms, elevator doors, vending machine coffee, and the sharp little ache of watching other people go home while I stayed under fluorescent lights, trying to keep strangers breathing. I am not dramatic by nature. I say that first because people hear family property dispute and imagine screaming in a driveway, plates breaking, somebody filming on a phone. That is not what happened here. What happened was quieter, and in some ways meaner. My Aunt Dahlia died in late October, just after the leaves turned the color of rusted pennies and the air started smelling like wet brick and chimney smoke. She had no children, no husband, no patience for people who only remembered her birthday when they needed something. The last year of her life, when her heart got worse and stairs became a negotiation, most of the family found reasons to stay busy. I did not. Neither did my cousin Sterling. He is technically my aunt's godson, not her son, and technically my cousin through my father's side, though in our family people use labels loosely when they are trying to claim closeness. Still, to be fair, he did show up in the beginning. He took her to 2 appointments when I got stuck on a double shift. He fixed a porch light once. He brought expensive pastries that she complained were too sweet. For a while, I thought we were on the same page. Then winter came, and the truth sorted itself out the way it usually does. I was the one refilling pill organizers at her kitchen table. I was the one calling insurance when a claim vanished into some cheerful bureaucratic graveyard. I was the one carrying laundry baskets down to the basement, while she sat at the top of the stairs, pretending she was just resting, not crying. I learned how she took her tea, where she hid cash and old greeting cards, which cabinet stuck in damp weather, and how her breathing sounded when she was trying to make it to the bathroom without waking me on the pull-out couch. Sterling started fading in and out. He was always on the verge of something. A partnership, a launch, a deal. He talked like a man narrating his own documentary. There was always a reason he could not stay long, and always a promise that once his next thing hit, he was going to help in a real way. Aunt Dahlia never argued with him. She would just tilt her head and say, "That boy loves a future more than he loves a Tuesday." After she died, I found out what she meant. The duplex had belonged to her for almost 30 years. It was nothing fancy. Red brick, narrow front steps, 1 unit upstairs, 1 downstairs, a magnolia tree out front that bloomed like it was showing off. The upstairs tenant had moved out 2 months before she got really sick, so that apartment sat empty while I cleaned it in pieces between shifts and tried not to think too hard about what it could mean for me. Because for the first time in a long time, I had allowed myself to picture a different life. I rented a 1-bedroom over a laundromat where the walls shivered every time the spin cycle hit. I was tired of hearing other people's arguments through drywall, tired of rent climbing while my body got older in hospital hallways, tired of living like stability was something that only happened to other women. I never asked Aunt Dahlia for the duplex, not once. When the will was read, I nearly dropped my pen anyway. She left the property to me and Sterling equally, half and half. She also left a modest investment account to be split the same way, along with some jewelry nobody fought over because it was sentimental and not expensive enough to become ugly over. Everyone around that conference table made the right noises: surprise, sad smiles, little nods about how generous she had been. Sterling squeezed my shoulder outside the lawyer's office and said, "We'll do right by this." I believed him. That part embarrasses me now. For about 3 months, everything looked manageable. We talked about repainting the upstairs unit. I met with a contractor about plumbing issues in the basement. Sterling said he wanted to think strategically before making permanent decisions, which sounded vague but not alarming at the time. I assumed he meant refinance options. Maybe renting 1 unit while I lived in the other. Normal things. Then he started talking about liquidity. That was the word he liked. Liquidity. He said it over dinner one night at a sports bar my brother Hayes picked because he thought neutral territory kept conversation civilized. Sterling said the market was hot enough to turn dead assets into movement. He said equity should work. He said Aunt Dahlia had been old school and emotionally attached to real estate, but our generation had to think differently. I set down my fork and asked, "Are you talking about selling?" He smiled like I was being cute. "I'm talking about options." Hayes looked at me over his beer and did not speak. That alone made me uneasy. My brother only gets quiet when he thinks something is already moving underneath him. I told Sterling I was not interested in selling. I said I wanted to move upstairs after some repairs, rent the downstairs later, and finally stop throwing money into rent every month. I said it calmly, practically, like an adult discussing her life. He leaned back and laughed once, not kindly. "Coco, come on. You'd really tie yourself to that place? You could take your half, clear debt, Breathe a little. I do not like when people call me Coco. He knew that. Aunt Dahlia used to, when I was little. Coming from him, it felt like he was borrowing tenderness to make me easier to steer. I am breathing, I said. He gave me a look that skimmed over my hospital badge on the table, my worn coat folded beside me, the careful way I count money without making it obvious. It was such a small look. That was the insulting part. So small that if I had described it later, someone would have said I was being sensitive. What I heard in it was simpler. You are tired enough to be convinced. A week later, my aunt's neighbor called me because 2 men had been on the porch measuring windows. I had not hired anyone. When I drove over after a 12-hour shift, my hands were still marked from gloves and sanitizer. Sterling was standing in the upstairs unit with a realtor I had never met, and a man in a camel coat who smelled like expensive cologne and impatience. They were in the living room, talking about opening up the wall between the kitchen and dining area for resale psychology. For a second, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong house. Sterling turned, saw me, and all the warmth slid right off his face. Not guilt, annoyance. "Oh," he said, "you're early." I looked at the realtor, then at the stranger, then at the legal folder tucked under Sterling's arm. There are moments when your body understands danger before your mind catches up. Mine did. My exhaustion burned off so fast it felt like fear. "What is this?" I asked. The realtor gave me that strained professional smile people use when they realize family members are not working from the same script. Sterling answered for her. "It's just a walkthrough. I told you I was exploring options." He had not, and standing there in the apartment I had scrubbed with my own hands, the one where I had already pictured my shoes by the door and my coffee mug by the sink and 1 decent year of peace, I realized I was the only person in that room who still thought this was a shared inheritance instead of an opening move. Before I tell you what was in that folder, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and comment your city, state, country, or first name. All right, now let me take you back. Because the worst part was not that he had brought strangers into the duplex without asking me. The worst part was that by then, this had already gone much farther than I knew. I held my hand out for the folder. Sterling did not give it to me right away. He just kept looking at me with that polished, patient expression people use when they have already decided you are the obstacle and they are the adult in the room. The realtor shifted her weight. The man in the camel coat checked his phone. "Colette," Sterling said quietly, "don't do this in front of people." That sentence did something to me. Not because it was loud, because it was practiced, because it told me there had already been conversations where I was cast as difficult, emotional, maybe unstable from overwork, and the only thing left was waiting for me to perform the part. I kept my hand out. "What is in the folder?" He finally passed it over like he was indulging me. Inside was a comparative market analysis, a proposed listing strategy, and a preliminary sheet showing projected sale ranges after minor cosmetic updates. My stomach tightened at the bottom where someone had already penciled in estimated net proceeds and percentages. He had not come to measure windows. He had come to prepare my future for sale. I looked at the realtor. "Did he tell you this property has 2 owners?" She hesitated, just a beat too long. "He said you were discussing the best route forward." The man in the camel coat gave me a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I buy distressed multifamily. Clean close. No drama." I stared at him. "Then you're in the wrong house." Sterling let out a breath through his nose, almost a laugh. "Can we stop with the theatrics?" That word landed harder than it should have. I had not raised my voice. I was standing there in hospital scrubs under my coat, holding his paperwork with both hands because my fingers had suddenly gone cold. I closed the folder. "No more strangers in this property without my permission," I said, "and no more meetings about selling unless I agree to them in writing." The realtor looked relieved. The investor looked irritated. Sterling looked at me like I had embarrassed him at a board meeting he should have chaired alone. He stepped closer after they left, lowering his voice. "You just made this harder than it needs to be." "For who?" "For both of us." I almost laughed then, but there was nothing funny in me. "You brought a buyer into my aunt's house without telling me. It's not your house." The second he said it, I saw the correction flicker across his face. Too late. Not our house. Not the house. My aunt's house. Not your house. My house. Something private and ugly had just shown itself. I went home, took off my shoes by the door of my little apartment over the laundromat, and sat on the side of my bed still wearing my coat. Down below, dryers thumped like distant fists. I kept replaying his face when I walked in, not guilty, annoyed, like I had interrupted a process, not confronted a betrayal. That was the first time I understood this was not about strategy or money or a different vision for the property. It was about him assuming I would eventually fold because I always had the most to lose. The next morning, I emailed the estate lawyer and asked one careful question. Had Sterling filed anything, signed anything, or represented to any third party that I had agreed to a sale, listing, transfer, renovation, or buyout discussion? The lawyer replied 2 hours later. No filings, no sale authority, no signed joint instruction. But there was one line that sat in my chest like a stone. Your cousin did ask whether one co-owner could compel a sale if the other party was being unreasonable. Being unreasonable. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I called Hayes. My brother is the kind of man who fixes cabinet hinges in silence and notices more than he says. We did not grow up especially close in a sentimental sense, but he is one of the few people in my family who has never mistaken my quiet for weakness. When I told him about the realtor and investor, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did he mention the refinance?" I sat up straighter. "What refinance?" Hayes swore under his breath. Apparently, 6 weeks earlier, Sterling had approached him at a cookout and started floating theories about unlocking underused value. Hayes thought it was just talk. Then Sterling asked whether Hayes knew anyone at a local credit union who moved fast on equity-backed lending. I felt that strange, sick clarity you get when missing pieces slide into place all at once. He was trying to borrow against his share. Looks like it, but he can't without my cooperation. Not cleanly, Hayes said, which is probably why he pivoted. I pressed my fingers against my eyes. Pivoted to what? Hayes did not answer immediately. "Colette, I think he's upside down." By evening, I knew he was right. Micro twist number 1 came from a woman I barely knew. The realtor called me from her office line. Her voice had that extra careful tone people use when they are stepping around liability. She said she should not be involved any further and wanted to make something clear. Sterling had told her the property needed to move fast because he had a personal deadline. He hinted at a family resolution, suggested I was emotionally attached but persuadable, and asked whether there were investors who could close before the end of the month. "Why the end of the month?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. Then after a pause, "But he asked twice." That same night, Sterling texted me as if nothing had happened. "Hey, sorry today got tense. I know you're exhausted and probably took it the wrong way. Maybe let's talk when you've had sleep." I stared at the message so long my screen dimmed. There is a special kind of rage that comes from being professionally managed by someone who has just tried to corner you. I did not answer. Instead, I called the credit union Hayes mentioned and asked broad questions I had every right to ask as a co-owner. The woman on the phone was polite and firm. She could not discuss any individual's application or inquiry. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still and thought about timing. End of the month. Fast close. Personal deadline. 3 days later, I got micro twist number 2. My father invited me to dinner. That alone was unusual. My father, Graham, prefers conversations that can be completed standing up. He is not cruel in the obvious ways. He is the kind of man who will hand you jumper cables in the rain, then spend the next 10 years quietly siding with whoever makes the least noise. He likes peace so much he often mistakes surrender for it. Dinner was at his house. Pot roast. Overcooked green beans. My stepmother trying too hard with the candles. Sterling was already there when I arrived, sitting at the table in a navy sweater like a man arriving for arbitration. I knew then that this was arranged. No one said it outright at first. They did what families do when they are trying to move you somewhere without using their hands. Small talk. Work. Traffic. A comment about how tired I looked. Then my father cleared his throat and folded his napkin. Sterling's had a rough quarter. I looked at my plate. I noticed. He made some mistakes, my stepmother said gently. But people do. Sterling gave her a grateful look so polished it almost impressed me. Then my father leaned in. There may be a way to solve this without selling the duplex. That got my attention, because it told me they had come prepared with a softer version first. What way? Sterling clasped his hands. I just need flexibility. Those were the words he used. Flexibility. Not money, not help, not rescue. He slid a printed sheet toward me, not a contract. Something looser, a proposal. If I allowed him temporary occupancy in the downstairs unit and agreed to delay any move-in plans upstairs, he could use the address to stabilize his situation, rebuild, and later buy me out or revisit a sale under better conditions. I read it once, then again. He had already written my life out of the duplex without saying so directly. Why would I delay moving in? It would only be for a little while. How long? A few months, maybe more. And what exactly are you stabilizing? Nobody answered right away. That was answer enough. I set the paper down and looked at my father. Did you read this before tonight? He nodded once. So you all discussed giving him access to the property before telling me. My stepmother reached for the salt shaker like she suddenly needed a task. Sterling looked annoyed that I had jumped a step. My father said we discussed options. No, I said softly. You discussed using my half to absorb his problem. Sterling's jaw tightened. It's not like that. Then explain it like what it is. He sat back. I'm in a temporary bind. With what? Cash flow. From what? He gave a short laugh. You wouldn't understand the structure. That was the moment I knew he was losing. Men like Sterling only become vague when the details make them look smaller. My father tried again. Colette, nobody is asking you to lose anything. I turned to him. If I cannot move in, if he uses the address, if he establishes occupancy, if everything gets delayed, if every repair turns into a fight, if every future decision gets tied to his timeline, then yes, I lose something. Sterling's expression hardened. You always think in worst cases. No, I think in consequences. The table went quiet. He looked at me for a long second, then said, You act like I'm trying to steal from you. I met his eyes. You brought an investor into the duplex without telling me. My stepmother flinched. My father looked at Sterling sharply for the first time that night. Sterling answered too fast. It was exploratory. I looked back at my father. Did you know that part too? He did not answer. There it was, the third shift. The one that changes humiliation into clarity. This was not a cousin in trouble asking for grace. This was a family room built in advance, with chairs already arranged, waiting for me to step into the role of reasonable woman who sacrifices quietly so everyone else can keep calling themselves loving. I folded the proposal in half, then again. No. Sterling smiled, but this time the smile was bare. You might want to think harder. A forced sale isn't impossible. My father said his name sharply. But I had already heard the important part, not that he could force one. That he had been looking into it hard enough to use the phrase like a threat. I stood, set the folded paper beside my plate, and reached for my coat. Before I left, I asked one small question. What exactly happens at the end of the month? No one spoke. Sterling looked at the candle between us and said, "Nothing you need to worry about." That told me everything. When I got back to my apartment, I did not cry. I wanted to. There was a hot pressure in my throat and behind my eyes that felt almost adolescent, which annoyed me more. I am old enough to know that families do not become unfair in a single night. They reveal the unfairness that was always easiest when the stakes were lower. I made tea. I sat at my tiny kitchen table. I opened my laptop. And because I have spent years watching bad situations get worse when people act from panic, I did the one thing Sterling had not accounted for. I stopped talking and started building a timeline. Every text, every call, every meeting, every mention of urgency, every witness, every paper, every inconsistency. Then, just after midnight, my phone lit up with a message from a number I did not know. It was a screenshot of a past due notice. The address at the top was Sterling's. The amount due was large enough that my stomach dropped. And beneath the screenshot was one line. He's not trying to move fast because he's ambitious. He's trying to move fast because he's drowning. I stared at the screenshot until the numbers blurred. The sender was my cousin's ex-girlfriend, Harlow. We had met twice, maybe 3 times. Always in crowded rooms where she seemed too smart for the role she had been cast in. Once at Aunt Dahlia's funeral. Once at a holiday brunch. Once at a rooftop thing Sterling hosted last summer, where everyone pretended the drinks and string lights meant the business was real. I called her. She answered on the second ring like she had been waiting for it. "I'm sorry," she said before I could speak. "I sat on this too long." I kept my voice level. "Why are you sending me this now?" "Because he said your name tonight." That chilled me more than the screenshot had. She told me they had broken up 6 weeks earlier, after months of what she called performance living. Expensive dinners on borrowed money, branded boxes for a company that was mostly a logo and a promise. A rented office suite he used for photos more than work. Investors he kept almost closing. Clients who were always just about to sign. At first she thought he was struggling, then she realized he was staging. "He started talking about a property solution," she said. That was the phrase. He said once the property issue was unlocked, everything would stabilize. I wrote that down. Then she said the thing that turned my pulse into something colder. I closed my eyes. "What kind of default chain?" She exhaled. "I only know pieces. There's business debt, at least one personal guarantee, and a short-term lender. He kept saying if he could get through the month, he could restructure." That word again, if he could get through the month. I thanked her, then asked if she would be willing to forward anything that mentioned the duplex, the timeline, or his stated plan. She said yes immediately. 10 minutes later, my email filled with screenshots. Not enough to create a miracle, more than enough to reveal a pattern. He had told her I would come around because I was practical. He had told someone else that family optics would force me not to make trouble. He had described the duplex as a soft asset, which I understood to mean an asset attached to a woman trained to keep peace. I sat there until the tea beside me went cold. Shame is a strange emotion. It does not always come from doing something wrong. Sometimes it comes from realizing how someone has measured you, how carefully they studied your decency and sorted it into weakness. By morning, I had made 3 decisions. First, I was done discussing this privately. Second, I was done answering feelings with feelings. Third, I was not going to accuse Sterling of anything I could not place cleanly in front of other adults. So I called the estate lawyer and requested a formal co-ownership meeting at his office. I said I wanted all future property discussions to happen there, with minutes. I also asked him a narrower question than before. If one co-owner attempted to represent shared property as solely controllable, brought in potential buyers without authorization, and sought occupancy arrangements that could complicate use, what protections should the other co-owner put in place immediately? His response was calm and devastatingly useful. No informal occupancy agreement of any kind. No verbal permissions. Change the entry code. Written notice to both parties that no showings, renovations, listings, or third-party access are authorized without mutual written consent. Secure copies of all property records. Document all interactions. So I did exactly that. I changed the code. I installed a simple camera at the front entrance. I sent the written notice by email and certified mail. Then I waited. Sterling called within an hour. "You changed the code?" "Yes." "You can't lock me out of my own property." "I can prevent unauthorized access after you brought strangers in without consent." He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Wow." I said nothing. You really want to do this? We're already doing it. Then I hung up. He texted me 3 minutes later. You are making a temporary problem permanent. I saved it. The formal meeting was set for Thursday afternoon. In the 3 days before it, the family campaign got louder because pressure always spikes when persuasion starts failing. My father called twice. I did not answer the first time. The second time, he said he only wanted to keep things from becoming public and ugly. I almost asked him what exactly he thought had already happened to me in private. Instead, I said all discussions would happen at the lawyer's office. My stepmother sent a long text about compassion and stress and how people make mistakes when they feel trapped. I noticed she still did not say what the mistake actually was. Hayes stopped by my apartment with grocery store flowers that looked apologetic. I should have told you earlier, he said. You did not know enough earlier. I knew enough to suspect. I looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I know. He leaned against the counter while dryers thudded below us. For what it's worth, Dad hates conflict so much, he keeps confusing the first person to resist with the cause of it. That sounds right. Hayes rubbed the back of his neck. Sterling came to me too. Asked if I'd talk you down. Said you were spiraling because work had made you rigid. I let out a slow breath through my nose. There it was again. The image management. The pre-written female role. Did you? No, I believed him. He was the one person who looked relieved when I said the meeting would be formal. Thursday came gray and wet. The lawyer's office smelled faintly like paper, coffee, and old carpet. Sterling arrived in a dark coat and an expression so composed it was almost elegant. My father came too, which irritated me until I realized why. Sterling wanted a witness for his own performance. Fine, I wanted one too. The lawyer began by summarizing the ownership structure, the requirement for mutual consent, and the consequences of disputed use. It was dry, precise, wonderful. Then Sterling started. He was good at this part. He framed everything as urgency without deceit, concern without pressure, exploration without overreach. He said he had been trying to identify options that protected both of us. He said I had become unexpectedly hostile. He said grief affects people differently, and maybe I had grown overly attached to the property as a symbol rather than an asset. I let him talk. I had learned enough in hospitals to know that some people collapse faster when nobody interrupts them. When he finished, the lawyer turned to me. I opened my folder. I had printed the realtor's email, the written notice, the screenshots Harlow sent, the text where he said family optics would keep me from making trouble, the message calling the duplex a soft asset, his text after I changed the code, the timeline, the dates, the sequence. I placed each page on the table one at a time. Then I said the only thing that mattered. I am not hostile, I am informed. Sterling's face did not change right away. That was almost impressive. Then I slid over the screenshot where he discussed gaining occupancy and asset access to stop the default chain. His hand moved first. Not to grab it, to flatten his own papers. A reflex, tiny, telling. My father frowned. What is that? Sterling answered too fast, out of context. I looked at the lawyer. He attempted to create third-party access without consent, discussed forcing a sale, proposed delaying my lawful use of the property while concealing material financial distress, and appears to have intended the duplex to serve as stabilization leverage in matters he never disclosed to me. Silence. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read more carefully. Then he asked Sterling a question so plain it sounded almost gentle. Are you currently under any personal or commercial financial obligations that could expose your interest in this property to outside pressure? Sterling's jaw shifted. He did not answer. The lawyer asked again. This time Sterling said, not directly, which is not an answer, it is a curtain. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to accuse him of fraud or theatrics or greed. All I had to do was keep removing his soft language and replacing it with fact. You needed an address, I said. You needed apparent control. You needed speed. You did not tell me that because if you told me the truth, I would have protected myself sooner. My father looked from him to me and back again. He had the expression of a man who has just discovered that neutrality was not wisdom after all. It was convenience with a better haircut. Sterling leaned forward then, finally dropping the polished tone. I was trying to solve it. With what? I asked. My future. That landed, not because it was dramatic, because it was exact. The room went quiet in a different way than family rooms do. No emotional fog, no hopeful confusion, just structure settling around truth. The lawyer cleared his throat and said, very carefully, that based on the level of mistrust and the nature of the newly surfaced concerns, he strongly recommended one of two paths. Either a formal agreement preserving exclusive use rights to me for a defined term with strict no encumbrance language, or a buyout at independently appraised value with full financial disclosure and no occupancy transfer pending execution. Sterling stared at him. Exclusive use rights? Yes, the lawyer said. Given that Ms. Collette intended to occupy one unit and that your recent actions created concrete concern, a protective agreement would be reasonable. I did not look at Sterling. I looked at the lawyer. I want the buyout option available to him first. Short deadline, verified funds only. If he cannot perform cleanly, I want the exclusive occupancy agreement and right of first refusal if he later attempts to sell his share. Sterling turned to me then. Really turned. No charm left. You've been planning this. No, I said. I've been surviving it. That was the major reveal. Though not in the flashy way stories usually sell them, the reveal was not hidden bloodlines or secret clauses or dramatic confessions. It was smaller and more brutal. He had not come to family for help. He had come to family for cover. Once the meeting ended, my father followed me into the hallway. His face looked older than it had a week earlier. "I didn't know it was like this," he said. I believed that too, not because he was innocent, because he was lazy in the specific way that causes damage without ever feeling like the villain. "You didn't ask," I said. He flinched. That should have satisfied me more than it did. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired in the deep, body-level way that comes when a fear you have been carrying finally proves itself real. The small final twist came 4 days later. Sterling could not buy me out. Of course he could not. Verified funds never appeared. Deadlines make reality less negotiable. So the lawyer drafted the occupancy and protection agreement. I got upstairs possession rights, immediate move-in authorization, shared maintenance rules, and language preventing either owner from using the property in support of unrelated obligations, without mutual written consent. If he ever tried to sell later, I got first refusal. I signed in blue ink. 2 weeks after that, on a cold Saturday morning, I carried my first box up the duplex stairs. The place smelled like fresh primer and old wood. Sunlight moved across the living room floor in a pale gold rectangle. Outside, the magnolia tree was bare and dark against the sky, all bones and promise. Hayes came by with a toolbox. We worked mostly in silence. Around noon, the front camera pinged my phone. Sterling was outside. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the windows like a man trying to calculate where a story had stopped obeying him. Then he walked up the steps and set something down by the door. After he left, I opened it. It was Aunt Dahlia's old key ring, the dented silver key still hanging from it. No note, just the keys. For a second, I stood there holding them, feeling something I did not expect. Not forgiveness, not triumph, just a hard, quiet understanding. He had finally returned the thing he thought was his to control. I locked the door with my own key after that. Not his, mine. The deadbolt clicked into place with the cleanest sound I had heard in months. Sometimes the ugliest thing in a family is not open cruelty. It is the way people try to make sacrifice sound like love when they have already decided who should pay. And that is what I keep thinking about. Because some people do not come to you for help. They come to you because they think your heart is easier to spend than their own. That part is real. That part happens all the time. I also think a lot about how calm gets misunderstood. People see somebody quiet, responsible, steady, and they think that means available. They think it means softer boundaries, easier access, less risk. But being calm does not mean being open for damage. It just means you learned how to hold your line without needing an audience. And honestly, I think that is why stories like this hit so hard. Not because of the property, not even because of the money. It is because a lot of people know exactly what it feels like when the family starts speaking in that careful tone, and you realize they are not asking what is fair. They are asking what they can get from the person least likely to explode. That is a lonely feeling. But once you see it clearly, it gets a lot harder for them to hide inside nice words.